Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Welcome to episode 115 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. If you're a friend of the show, welcome back. Thanks so much for listening. And if you're a new listener, welcome. In this show, we talk about RPGs from the GM's perspective, but I also try to bring in the player's perspective as much as I can. In recent episodes, I've been doing a lot of world building where I'm creating my own D&D homebrew world, Primordia. In the last episode, episode 114, we talked about guild dues and perks. Today, I'm talking about the guild some more and also the diversity of religions in Primordia. So this is our 17th world building episode. I've been doing a lot of these world building episodes here in season 6, but I'm having a lot of fun doing them. I've been getting a lot accomplished and done with the world building. And I've also been getting a lot of feedback on the world building, and it seems that the lion's share of feedback that I do get is on the world building topics. So it seems like you're really digging it too. So I guess we're all happy. Now, I am planning in the near future to do an episode on running RPGs using theater of the mind. So not using miniatures or a grid or that kind of thing. Just doing it old school, theater of the mind, where the GM describes what the players see and what's around them. The players ask questions to clarify what's around them and what they can and can't do. And it's just this back and forth conversation between the GM and the players. And I'm a big fan of theater of the mind, but it's not an easy thing to do, and it does require its own skill set and things to work on and whatnot. So I thought I would do an episode, or maybe even a series of episodes, on theater of the mind and giving you whatever tips and tricks I can on how to do theater of the mind well, especially in like combat encounters, how to convey the scene so that your players know what's going on and things don't get bogged down. Maybe we could discuss some of the pros and cons of theater of the mind compared with using miniatures in a grid. So if you're someone that uses theater of the mind as a GM and you have any tips or tricks or thoughts or advice for a GM who's maybe new to theater of the mind, or just a GM who's looking for ways to improve in using theater of the mind, let me know. Shoot me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, and I will collect as many as I can to discuss on the episode, so that we can all be better theater of the mind GMs. But we're not doing that today. Today's going to be another feedback world building episode. And I'm going to start out with just some feedback on last week's episode 114. So Brett Nilsson commented on the episode on our Google Plus community and said, another great idea generating episode. And this one is hitting close to home. I really like the use and relevance of guilds in game, not just as a resource for the players, but as a way of propelling the story forward. The characters can be given contracts to fulfill, or even hear rumors or stories of other exploits that may pique their adventuring interests. And yeah, Brett, I totally agree. The guild in Primordia, or any guild really, is a great way to provide adventure hooks for the player characters. And, you know, my idea with the guild in Primordia is that there will always be bounties available. And I'm thinking bounties, I'm thinking like the contracts in The Witcher 3, if you played that game, where it's literally just as simple as, hey, someone spotted a monster in this area, you know, go check it out. And if there is a monster and you take care of it, you'll get a reward of X amount of gold. And the idea is that there will always be numerous of those bounties available. So as a DM running a Primordia campaign, I would always have a handful of those on hand in case the PCs say, hey, I want to go see what bounties are available. I can actually have handouts to give them, well, here's the bounties you see posted on the notice board or whatever. And then they could choose to do one of those. And each of those bounties would kind of be probably like a session worth of adventure, just going and facing a single monster or a single group of monsters or whatever in the area around Alondria. And my thought is in addition to the bounties, that there will also be missions that the guild will send PCs on. And these could be posted as well. Like there's just a notice board in the guild hall that says, hey, there's this mission and we need a team to do it. Or it might be something where a superior in the guild comes to the player characters and requests specifically that they carry out a certain mission. And I'm thinking the missions will be more the kind of thing of, hey, we heard of this ruin, in this location, and we need a team to go check it out, see if there's anything of value there, and, salvage what you can, and that kind of thing. So the bounties will be a very kind of like a one-shot kind of go defeat this monster that's causing troubles, where the missions will be more involved, involve some travel and probably exploring a dungeon or something like that. And I'm thinking that the bounties will have a reward posted, like 100 gold for the head of this giant that's rampaging nearby, where the missions would be more the type of thing where the guild would want a share of the booty, like I talked about in the last episode. And something I forgot to point out in the episode was that, the things I discussed as far as perks that you get for being part of the guild, those are just things that are above and beyond all the usual stuff that you would expect from a guild. So all the stuff in the relevant backgrounds in the Player's Handbook and the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide as far as what a guild can do for you, as well as just, things that it makes sense that a guild would do. Like if you get in trouble, they're going to, vouch for you. They can give you loans, things like that. So what I talked about yesterday or last episode wasn't everything the guild does. It was just kind of the stuff that the guild does above and beyond what I think most guilds would do. So Brett goes on to say, in regards to the economy of guilds, I've kept it fairly simple for the time being, at least for the 2 guilds I've introduced so far. The guild offers contracts and missions to its journeymen for a set price, which already excludes the amount of coin going directly to the guild for the job. Thanks for the episode. So yeah, that's a great way to handle, the guild dues and the kind of economical side of that. And, the nice thing with the way Brett's doing it is it's super easy. There's not any paperwork or record keeping involved. He's just saying, this is what the guild's going to pay you to do this thing. And they've already gotten their cut, so we don't have to worry about giving a percentage or a share to the guild. And I really like that. I'm always looking for things that are simple and elegant and aren't going to add any bookkeeping to the game or bog things down. So, I need to decide for myself in my world how the bounties and missions, which I think is pretty much the same thing as what Brett is saying here with the contracts and missions. We're basically talking about the same thing, I think. How those are going to pay out. Like I said, I could see the bounties being a fixed reward. And in that case, it would be like what Brett's talking about, where, the PCs don't need to give the guild a cut. They're already getting their cut or something. And the missions, I think, might be where I do the thing of the PCs give the guild a certain percentage or they give them a share or something like that. But I'm still kind of weighing options because I am concerned that giving the guild a share is going to, add a level of complexity that maybe I don't want, and there's no real gain from having it. Our Friend of the show, Boz Bunnick, also commented on Google Plus on the last episode, and he says, and he's talking about the first segment of the show last week when I was talking about a listener who'd had issues with GMs who made their bard characters actually sing or perform in real life at the table, and made their spellcasting characters, whenever they cast a spell with a verbal component, come up with what the actual words of that component are. So Boz says, wow, respect to anyone who keeps up with playing in an RPG game, having to act the bard songs out and come up with lyrics for their spells. Yeah, that one had me rewinding, listening again, and being astonished. Yeah, that's kind of how I felt. I was just amazed, not only that he'd encountered a DM that was like this, but that every DM he's encountered has been like this. Boz says, I like the way the guild is getting used. The banking idea, in traditional sense of this being where you store money and how to use it in trade, not banking as we think of it today, is perfect. It would also make it incredibly easy to police against adventurers paying the guild its share or trying to cheat the guild. If they don't, if the guild is providing vaults where, treasure can be stored and whatnot, and the PCs don't want to store it with the guild because they don't want the guild to know how much treasure they have because they don't want to give the guild their share, then they're going to have to store it somewhere else, right? And like Boz points out in his comment, he's like, what are they going to do? Hide it in a basement somewhere? And whatever they do, it probably won't be as secure as the vaults that the guild maintains. So there would be more risk in trying to, cheat the guild and keep some treasure on the sly. So he says the whole thing makes sense. You prove yourself, get admitted, receive some perks, and work for the guild and pay them a share in money, items, etc. Of course, you would love to get the next tier and maybe have to work harder for it too. What Brett above mentions, where the guild sets a reward for missions, could work in that frame too. So I think here Boz is talking about advancing in the guild. And I've talked about with the guild, I'm going to use the renown system in the DMG where I have these different ranks. And right now they're apprentice, journeyman, master, grandmaster. And each of those ranks have a minimum level requirement. Like you have to be at least 5th level to become a journeyman, I believe it is. And so they have a minimum level requirement, but you also have to have enough standing or renown or reputation with the guild to get that rank. So it's not just you get to the level and boom, you get promoted. You also have to earn that promotion by having good enough standing in the guild. And so I'm going to have a renown system, just like in the DMG, where you have an actual score that represents how well the guild thinks of you. And you will earn points by doing contracts and missions and bounties for them and finding cool things for them to study and surrendering those to the guild. So that's how you would get standing within the guild. Boz goes on to say, I really like the items you made for your PCs in the Tyranny of Dragons game. All had a nice flavor and fit the characters. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm glad you liked them. And for patrons of the show, if you're at a tier where you get access to my Primordia design diary, those are in there. I put those in there so the patrons can check those out and use them in their games if you want, or just use it as kind of inspiration for how, some of those items were common items taken right out of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I just added some flavor to them. Or some of them were fairly common items that I added a few more little perks to. So it might be a good example to you of how you can do that in your own game. I also like items that the PCs find to make sense within the actual game they're playing, as well as to fit the players so that they can get the most use out of them. Trading the less useful items for the party in at the guild, either getting something better to replace the item or getting money, feels really sensible and convenient. So yeah, thanks, Boz. Part of what I'm trying to do with the guild, and I talked about this a little bit on the last episode, is I'm trying at the same time to make it make sense in world, as far as, this is an organization that it makes sense it would exist in this world, and the way things are done and the way it works makes sense that that's the way an organization like that would be run. But I also want to use it as a way to bring some of the metagame stuff that happens around most of our tables into the game so it can be in character and not be something that as a DM you're maybe wondering, should I let this happen? Is this cool or not? So like the idea of building a good party where you have healing ability and you've got arcane magic ability and you've got maybe some sneaking or lock opening ability and you've got fighting ability, making that something that would actually be discussed by the characters in world because they're trying to put together an adventuring team, just like putting together a rock band was the example I kept using. So if you're forming a band, of course you're going to talk about what each person can do and how they're going to fit into that group and what's their purpose in that group going to be. So the same thing with adventuring teams in Primordia. I mean, it's not going to be out of character to ask, well, who among us can heal? Or who among us can wear heavy armor? Or who among us knows about magic? That is something that any adventuring team in Primordia would have to discuss, because in order to get into the guild, you have to form a team first and you have to have successful adventures first. And I think part of the idea that I don't think I mentioned last week is when you come to petition the guild, you're also bringing some treasure to give to the guild. So it's like, not only am I going to tell this tale of this adventure we went on and how we kicked ass and took names, but here's the proof, and here are some magic items or some treasure that we found that we think the guild might be interested in. So that's the other side of it too. You can't necessarily just go out and fight some goblins and get into the guild. You need to find something of worth to the guild, whether it's a magic item they might want to study or something of historic significance or something like that, or just achieve something important. So going out in the woods and killing a few random goblins isn't going to cut it. But if there's maybe a tribe of goblins that has moved into the area and is harassing the city, and you deal with that, then that would be something notable that the guild would appreciate.
This is Matthew Colville, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
I like to take a moment at this part of the show and send a shout out and a thank you to all the loyal patrons of Starwalker Studios who help make this show possible. And especially I want to thank my Tier 6 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve. Yeah. Go Steve.
Yes.
So the patrons of Starwalker Studios support the show and get some cool little perks for doing so. Some of the things I do for patrons is I do a monthly podcast just for the patrons. I also do my Primordia Design Diary, which is every month I put up something for the patrons that I've come up with for Primordia, whether it's a monster or magic items or whatever I feel like putting up that month. There's other little things too. So you can find out more about that at starwalkerstudios.com. In the show notes for this episode, you can find a link to my Patreon page. And at the bottom of the show notes, you can find lots of other great ways to help out as well. And one of those is checking out battlebards.com, where you can get some awesome audio to use for your tabletop RPGs. You can get music to use in the background or various sound effects of monsters and spells and weapons hitting armor and things like that. Really cool stuff. So if you check out battlebards.com and you like what you see and you're going to buy something, check out my show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. I've got some coupon codes for you that will get you some free additional bonus tracks on your first order at battlebards.com. All right, for our main topic today, we're going to discuss some of the world building feedback from listeners like you. And we're going to start out with some feedback from Matthew Hayden on Google+, who says, "Great show today, Lex. I was thinking one of the noble houses arriving in Alandria and realizing that there is a power saturation with all the other noble houses arriving would form a thieves guild." Well, yeah, what a great idea if there isn't already one. Or maybe they'd form a rival thieves guild to compete with the Thieves Guild that already exists. Matthew says, the other thing I was thinking with mythals was, as you spoke about, some prevent dragonfire, others undead from entering and things like that. So this could be why some cities survived and others didn't. The right things attacked, but other cities, the mythals provided no defense against those things. So yeah, that's a great idea too. Now, one thing that I'm thinking that all of the mythals do that they have in common is they protect from planar rifts opening. And those planar rifts opening all over the place were the source of the problems during the time of the retreat. But Matthew's absolutely right. Some mythals might be better protection against certain threats than others. So that's an awesome idea, and definitely some story fodder there. And as a GM, I am always looking not only for ideas that are cool and, oh yeah, that makes sense and that seems cool, but I'm really on the lookout for ideas that seem to lend themselves to creating stories or being able to create stories around those ideas. So having this idea of, not all the mythals being the same, and maybe this mythal protects against dragons and that one protects against undead and but not vice versa, that's story potential, because you could have a city that's being besieged by dragons and the mythal doesn't protect them or something like that. So that's really cool stuff. Boz Bunnick also commented again and said, I also wanted to mention the part where you pointed out the difference between a priest or ranked clergy and a cleric or paladin adventurer who has actually gained the eye of their god and received divine powers. One would expect that at least some of the priesthood in the official ranks, and he's speaking of the Church of the Nine here, would have some amount of cleric levels. Of course, the church would mostly look unfavorably towards those freelancing no-better types, claiming to have a direct line to the gods, like you mentioned. On the other hand, if these gods have their religious orders, etc., they would probably want to harness the power of these individuals and get them to align with their sects to have some control over them. Of course, the tension between mixed loyalty to a church or sect and the Adventurers Guild would then become a thing. So yeah, those are all really good points and really good thoughts. My thoughts and how I'm approaching it with Primordia, and of course you may do things totally differently in your world that you're building, is that paladins and clerics are chosen by their gods. It's not so much a thing that someone decides to become a cleric or someone decides to be a paladin. They're chosen, and a lot of times, they're the reluctant hero. They don't want to be a paladin. They don't want to be a cleric, but they're chosen by their god for whatever reason. And, maybe they were already a devout follower of that god, and that's part of the reason they were chosen, but maybe they weren't. Maybe they weren't devout or religious at all. Who knows why the gods do what they do or why they choose who they choose. And, some of my inspiration for this was the Oracle class from Pathfinder, which I really liked the difference between an Oracle as opposed to a cleric in Pathfinder. And an Oracle was very much like I'm picturing clerics in Primordia, where, they're chosen by a god, often or even usually against their will or without them really wanting to be chosen. And, they're not even necessarily happy about it. So you could have a cleric who's a cleric of a god, but he doesn't really want to be a cleric, and he doesn't really want to further his god's agenda, but he kind of has to because he's been chosen. And, I'm sure the gods have ways of making you do things whether you want to or not. Some of them subtle, some of them not so much. So my reasoning behind the people involved with the Church of the Nine is what I'm mainly talking about here, which is this kind of I see it, the Church of the Nine is almost a secular church, if that's a thing. I see it as very secular. Like the Church of the Nine is much more a political body and is much more concerned with politics and wielding their power. I'm thinking that they're kind of the judicial branch of the government of Elandria. So they have the courts and they have the trials because If they do have any spellcasters, they would have the ability to cast things like Zone of Truth. But again, I said that I'm thinking that the Church of the Nine is more secular and they don't actually have clerics and paladins in their midst. Those are associated with the mystery cults, or they're just on their own doing their own thing. So you might wonder, well, how are they going to have Zone of Truth and stuff like that if they don't have spellcasters? I'm actually thinking that they don't have spellcasters, and those effects are either provided by magic items that they use on the sly, or they're actually enchantments on specific rooms in the temple or whatever. So in the courtroom, there's just a Zone of Truth present at all times, or maybe it's just present around the witness stand or something like that. So I'm thinking that the Church of the Nine actually doesn't have spellcasters in their midst, but they do have access to some clerical magic in the form of magic items and enchanted rooms or whatnot. And they use that as kind of smoke and mirrors to make it seem like they have divine favor and power when they really don't. And, I think, I'm trying to get some inspiration from history here. So, personally, I see a lot of parallels between the Church of the Nine and organized religion like we have it here on Earth. And, so I think it's going to be fun to have this world where we have both a kind of like this secular religion where they're not really following the gods and they don't really have any influence or favor from the gods, and they're more worried about power in the world and power over people and power over minds and power in the government. And then in the same world, you have these mystery cults who are literally people who honestly believe in the gods and are granted powers and abilities to work miracles from the gods and can do all these crazy things that people in the church can't do. And, most like your average, say, citizen of Elandria doesn't really have any experience with people from mystery cults or with the mystery cults because they're secret organizations. When they think religion, they think of the Church of the Nine. And so, you could have this thing where your average citizen of Elandria pays lip service to the gods and maybe makes offerings at the Church of the Nine or at various shrines or whatever, but isn't really a true believer. And kind of has this mindset of, well, if I do, if I phone it in and pay lip service to the gods, then they'll stay out of my way and I'll stay out of theirs. And I don't really have to deal with them. Where, the mystery cults are where the people who really believe in the gods go. So I suppose that it's possible that a priest in the Church of the Nine could be chosen to be a cleric. And I think that could be an interesting story, right? You have this priest in this kind of secular, political, quote, church who's really not religious at all. It's all a bunch of bullshit. And he's actually chosen by a god. And that would be a fun story to tell. And like how would he react to that? And how would he change as a character? And one thing I want to do is I want to start writing fiction in Primordia, because I think one of the best ways to illustrate the way a setting works and things like that is to tell stories in that setting. And so I've been looking for interesting characters to tell interesting stories about. And I think telling a story about a priest like that, who starts out as a priest in the Church of the Nine and doesn't really have any real experience with the gods, gets chosen by a god, and how that just turned his life upside down. I think that'd be a fun story to tell. So as part of a cleric's awakening, someone being chosen as a cleric, she would realize that her god has plans for her and plans kind of larger scale that she's going to be a part of. And that the Church of the Nine, doesn't have anything to do with those plans and is completely outside of them. Like, they're not working for the gods. They're working for themselves. I think that one reason clerics and paladins would often be branded as heretics by the church or churches is because almost all of the clerics and paladins come to the realization that the churches aren't really doing the God's will at all. They're in it for themselves. They're in it for personal gain and power, or just that good feeling of thinking that you're special compared to other people. So the churches are doing what they're doing for their own reason. It's got nothing to do with what the gods want. And maybe they believe that what they're doing is ordained by the gods, or maybe they don't. It probably varies from individual to individual, but they don't actually have any real communication with the gods. So it's just as likely that that what they think is, quote, right or wrong is their imagination or their own justification for what they want to do anyway. And their real motives are personal, political, etc. So, this conflict is really something I want to explore in the world, this conflict between the church or churches and the mystery cults. I think that'll be really fun to explore. And it could be fun even for a player character if a player wanted for their character's backstory to say that they're in the church and have rank in the church, and then they were chosen to be a cleric or a paladin. That would be fun for a player to explore too, I think. So, the churches and the masses who follow them are for the most part misguided. Their prayers and offerings provide mystical fuel for the gods. And, occasionally their prayers or offerings are answered or acknowledged, but ultimately they don't really have any real rapport with the gods. On the other hand, you have clerics and paladins and the followers of the mystery cults who do have rapport with the gods. But the clerics and paladins, at least, tend to be part of the guild, not the church, and on various quests for their gods. So a cleric may be part of the Guild of Adventurers, probably would be, and sometimes that cleric is doing things for the guild, but then sometimes their god is going to send them a dream or a vision or a messenger of some kind and send them off on some quest for the god. And, something I haven't really gotten into a whole lot, or maybe even at all, is the guild actually has kind of like founding fathers. There are a group of individuals who formed and created and started the guild some time ago. And some of these were powerful individuals. Some of them were gods. So the guild itself actually has a few patron gods who have a vested interest in the guild. So, if your character is a cleric and you're a member of the guild, even if you're not following one of the gods that's the patron or a patron of the guild is still going to respect if you're like, hey, my god needs me to go do this thing. I'm going to be gone for a few months. The guild's going to respect that, and they're not going to get in your way. So the clerics and paladins aren't building churches or presiding over churches or anything like that. Instead, they're on missions for their gods. And my goal as a dungeon master would be that most of the time when you are on a mission for your god, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. You might find yourself wondering, why am I doing this? Why does my god even care about this? This seems so unrelated to anything. And even when you think that you understand why you're doing what you're doing for your god, you're never going to know. It's not like your god is going to tell you why. Your god's not like, I want you to do this thing for these reasons. Your god's like, do this thing. And that's it. Don't ask questions. Just obey. G. Ferg wrote in and asked, does your world's religion have some kind of holy book? If so, is there a separate one for each god or just one for the 9 with maybe a section dedicated to each? If the church is made up of non-cleric priests, how can it possibly attract followers when compared to the actual healers that are out and about curing people of diseases and deadness? Curing you of death. Maybe there are actual clerics in the high positions of power in the church. Just what does the church have to offer if not healing? Don't the people question the power of the gods if they can't or won't fix Primordia? Or has the church turned it into a we're all sinners, so this is the god's punishment kind of thing? So yeah, those are some great questions. As far as the holy books, I imagine there are a variety of holy books used by various churches and cults. And, kind of what I'm seeing is there are churches dedicated to each deity, numerous churches, in different cultures, different cities and whatnot. And I'm thinking the Church of the 9 it might be something limited just to Alondria, or it might be a wider thing. but it's kind of this popularized, kind of secularized religion that just makes it really easy for the average person. Just, you just follow the Church of the Nine and you're covered. You're giving honor to all the gods and you're covered. And the church kind of helps you appease all the gods and lets you know, oh, for this god, you need to do this. And for that god, you need to do that. Keeping in mind that all this stuff is created by people and the gods don't care about any of it. So as far as what the church has to offer, I thought this was actually kind of funny because he's like, if the church is made up of non-cleric priests who don't have spells, how can it possibly attract followers if, they can't cure disease or anything like that? And kind of my question to that is, well, how do churches in the real world attract followers? They don't raise people from the dead. They don't cure the sick. They don't really do anything. Their priests can't perform miracles, but tons of people believe in them and follow them and donate money to them and all that stuff. So I don't think it'd be any different in Primordia. The church would offer similar things as what churches do in our world. It offers the illusion of having control over the world around you, of having the God's ears and being in their favor, and bad things won't happen to you because you make your offerings to the church every month or whatever. It offers social cohesiveness within the society and a shared mythology to kind of pull people together. And it's a place for people to socialize and meet people. So, this idea of the Church of the Nine, which G. Ferg originally presented to me, I'm really digging it, and I'm really inspired by the portrayal of illusion. Freudian slip there. The portrayal of religion in Game of Thrones. I think there's often this assumption that we make that in a world where the gods are real, everyone would believe in them and everyone would understand that they're real. And I really like how Game of Thrones takes that and kind of turns it on its head. And it's like, well, it seems like at least some of the gods in Game of Thrones are real. Or at least there's something posing as that god. For instance, the god of light, I think it's called the fire god, where they burn people. We've seen numerous times people basically do miracles in service to that god. So there seems to be something there answering those people's prayers. Whether or not it's a god, who knows? But I mean, what does it really matter? There's something there. But then there's the seven, which you never, or at least so far in the show, haven't seen any real evidence that it's anything other than just bullshit that people made up, right? And so I don't think that it is true that in a world where the gods were real, that everybody would know that they're real or that everybody would believe that they're real. Because again, most people aren't going to have any experience with the gods. Clerics and paladins are rare. It's not like there are clerics and paladins all over the place healing people, making people think that the church is bogus because they can't heal people. And I'm sure the members of the church, and especially the officials, are very good at spinning things so that what they're doing is good and right, and what the clerics and paladins are doing are good and evil, and claiming that their power comes from a bad place or something like that. I mean, we see tons of this in our own world, how easily charismatic figures can just pull the wool over people's eyes and make them believe pretty much anything. Because people will believe pretty much anything, and you don't even have to prove it to them. You just have to make a very emotional speech and speak to their emotions and get them to feel like what you're saying makes sense, and you're there. It doesn't have to actually make sense. So in Primordia, I'm going for more mysterious gods. Most people have never really had any real interaction with a god in their entire life. Most people rely on faith and belief. Just like in the real world, the only people who really see proof of the deities with their own eyes tend to be adventurers. Although, of course, common everyday people will ascribe all kinds of things to the hands of the gods, whether or not they have anything to do with the gods or not. Anything from a freak storm to a sudden drought, or someone has a stillbirth, or, all kinds of stuff, people will say that's because some god did something, whether or not it's true. And I like the idea of there still being doubt for most people, that most people don't know for sure what's true and what's not. And I like that the people who are the most vocally religious and the most, in your face with their religion and raising their hands, praying out loud on the street corners and stuff, are the members of the Church of the Nine. And they're really in it for what they can get out of it, and money and influence and stuff like that. While the true believers, which are your clerics and your paladins and members of the mystery cults, are, first of all, usually fairly secretive and not in your face with what they're doing. And second of all, they tend to be seen as fanatics and weirdos by the quote normal people. So that's kind of, how I want to do it in Primordia. But again, if you're building your own world, you can do whatever you want and do things completely differently. And that's the beauty of building your own world. I've been doing a lot of these feedback episodes lately, mainly because I get so much phenomenal feedback from listeners like you. So if you have something that you'd like to share, whether it's world building related or not, whether it's advice or a question or anything, there are a lot of great ways you can get a hold of me. You can visit my website at starwalkerstudios.com. You can find the show notes for all the episodes there. You can find my other podcasts there. And you can find all the different ways that you can get in touch with me there. You can also email me directly at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker, and you can follow me on Google plus Lex Starwalker. All right, back to world building feedback. I got a great message from Will Johnson some time ago, and Will's been on the show. It's been a while now, but Will's been on and shared his insights with us before. And Will had a lot of great thoughts. He says, I'm finally caught up and wanted to provide some feedback regarding gods in Primordia. Like you, I've studied a lot of world religions in college. When you mentioned only 9 deities, immediately I clenched up because it might mean a lack of cultural and religious diversity within Primordia. And I completely agree that would be a bad thing, but I don't think that's going to be true, but we'll get to that. One solution to this is something you briefly touched upon when you mentioned that perhaps your 9 deities would provide divine magic to worshipers of other deities visiting Primordia and still worshiping their own gods. This is actually a solution that existed within the Forgotten Realms. Sylvanus, the god of nature, I would say one of Forgotten Realms' many gods of nature. Who can count them all? It's like finding Waldo. They're everywhere. Who the other nature gods serve, not only provides divine magic to clerics and druids who worship him, he also provides it to atheists, agnostics, nature worshippers, and followers of esoteric philosophies, as long as these people share his focus on nature. For years, the Karanok family worshipped primordial entropy in the form of a sphere of annihilation. They received divine magic because Tiamat began answering their prayers. This is only one of several cults Tiamat covertly took over. If I were designing Primordia, I'd stick with the 9 gods, each in control of their major domains. I'd then have them be worshipped in many different ways under many different names by various cultures. And that's basically what I'm doing with the aspects. The only difference is I'm not doing the many different names thing. They all have the same name. Perhaps only a few philosophers have realized that in reality, there are only the 9 true gods. In practice, this may mean slight tweaks to domain powers based on the way it is practiced. An island death cult which practices ritualized cannibalism will likely have very different rituals, names for the gods, and domain powers from a group of scholastic necromancers who worship the god of death. So I wanted to share this on the show because even though I'm kind of going a different direction than what Will's talking about here, I think he's got a lot of great thoughts here. And for you developing your world, these are all really cool things to think about, different ways that you can handle gods in your world. How many gods are there? Are all the gods that people believe in real gods, or do people believe in things that don't even exist? And, there are just so many questions that you could ask and answer about how gods work in your world. And there's so many different ways you could go about it. So, what Will's talking about here are some different approaches you could take. So I thought that I would talk about kind of more on how I'm approaching religion and the deities in Primordia. And, it occurred to me reading a lot of the feedback that I don't think I've done a very good job of explaining everything. And I think part of the problem is I've done so many of these episodes. This is number 17. And there are kind of bits and pieces all, strewn throughout 17 episodes. So it's understandable that it's kind of hard to take all that and put it together and kind of know where I'm coming from on certain things. So today I'm going to talk a bit about some of the things that Will brought up or brought to my mind as I was reading his feedback. So I think what I'm going to do is in a future episode, I will take one of the gods. I think I'll use Ion, my goddess of knowledge, and use her for an example and share some aspects of Ion with you to really illustrate how I'm going to do the different aspects and how the different aspects of Ion will, for all intents and purposes, be different deities as far as how they're perceived by people in the world, but they'll all be called Ion. They'll have different titles because names are important and the gods care about their names. But they'll have very different religions and beliefs and whatnot associated with them, but they're the same deity. They'll have the same domain and stuff like that. So I think the best way to illustrate that is with an example. So I'm going to do that in a future episode. So I thought what I could do first is define some terms that I kind of throw around and have a very specific understanding and definition for, and just assume that people are on the same page. But how could you be if I don't share this with you? So when I talk about a priest, when I use the word priest, I am talking about a devoted follower of a god, often a leader in a church, but they don't have spells or supernatural abilities. When I talk about a cleric, I'm talking about a person chosen by a god or gods to serve them. This person will have spells and supernatural powers, and this is the cleric PC class. When I talk about a paladin, this is a warrior chosen by a god or gods to serve them, or more rarely, one who chooses to serve the gods. And this person also has spells and supernatural powers, and again, this is the same as the PC class. So to get to some of the points that Will brought up, and again, this is one of those instances where I have someone give really good feedback, have really great ideas, but I've already got kind of things figured out for my world, how I'm going, and I don't want to just throw it out the window and do something different because I really like what I've come up with. But that's not to say that Will's ideas aren't good ideas or wouldn't be something awesome for you to do in your world. It's just, I had my ideas first and I kind of like my ideas. And again, there's a lot of groundwork that's been done for Primordia that I just haven't had time to share on the show, at least not yet. So having 9 deities and only having 9 deities in Primordia does not mean a lack of cultural diversity. And the reason is the aspects. So the deities have various aspects, and those aspects may have and probably will have different titles or nicknames. So Ion, you might have Ion, patroness of Elandria, might be one aspect. So the people of Elandria have a very specific idea of who Ion is and what she represents, what she values, what she expects from people, and things like that. And they refer to Ion as the patroness of Elandria. She is the patron of the city of Elandria, and they worship her in that way. But if you went outside of Elandria to somewhere else, maybe some other city, they might view Ion as the guardian of history and have maybe very different or maybe only slightly different beliefs and ideas of who Ion is and what she expects from them. So you would have two very different religions worshiping what on the surface might seem like two very different deities, but they're both worshiping Ion. They both call her Ion, but they have different titles or nicknames for her to better express their own particular take on Ion. So although the deities do have these various aspects, and those aspects might have different titles or nicknames, the gods do not tolerate worshipers using the wrong names for them or names of other deities. So you can't start worshiping Ion and decide you're going to call her Betty instead. Ion isn't going to tolerate that. Now, if you're just one dude calling her Betty, you're probably not worthy of her notice. But if you start building a religion or a church worshiping the god Betty, Ion's going to come have a talk with you, or one of her servants will. Also, no other deities have influence in Primordia. So, as Will pointed out, you can have this idea like in Forgotten Realms where someone could bring the worship of a deity from somewhere else. So maybe you have a group of elves that come into Forgotten Realms through a portal or something from another world, and they bring their own deity that they worship in this other world. Before now, this deity didn't exist in Forgotten Realms, but now it does. And that's one of the ways that Forgotten Realms has ended up with way too many deities. That doesn't happen in Primordia. Anyone who was worshiping anything other than one of the 9 deities would be worshiping nothing. They'd be praying to themselves. And they would find those prayers unanswered because they're praying to nothing. And I'm specifically trying to avoid the convoluted shenanigans of the various pantheons and whatnot that we see in Forgotten Realms. And I think what some of the stuff Will brought up is a perfect example of the kind of crap I'm trying to avoid. Like, it just gets way too convoluted. And, so if we took that example of elves coming from another world, they worship some other god, what would happen is they come into Primordia and they'd probably still be worshiping their god because they don't know any better, but they'd see that their prayers are being unheard. And eventually, if they had actual clerics or paladins in their midst, or anyone else who had some kind of way of knowing what was going on with the gods, these people would figure out that we can't connect with this god anymore. It's like this god doesn't exist here, because the 9 deities of Primordia are very powerful. They split reality between them, and there's nothing left over. There's no little niche that some new god could come in and claim, because they claim everything. And any other deity who tried to come in, if they even could, the 9 would band together and destroy them or kick them out of the dimension or universe or whatever that Primordia is in. So what would happen with these elves is, they'd come to Primordia, and right away they'd realize, oh, our prayers aren't being answered, our spells don't work anymore. And then what would happen is they would be approached by one of the 9 deities, or, well, more likely a servant of one of the 9 deities. Although maybe an avatar might show up. If they're a big enough group of elves and they're devout followers of their god, it might be worthy of an actual avatar of a deity showing up to talk to them. And so let's say that the elves worship Sylvanus. Why not? They came from Forgotten Realms. They worship Sylvanus, a nature deity. They come into Primordia. They're praying to Sylvanus. Nothing's happening. They're like, what the hell? So the deity of Primordia, who would be equivalent to Sylvanus, who would have the nature domain, who would be a nature deity, would be the goddess Primordia. So Primordia sends an avatar to these elves and says, greetings, welcome to Primordia. I am the goddess Primordia. Your god Sylvanus does not exist here, does not have any influence here. I am the deity of Primordia, who serves the same function in this world that your god Sylvanus does in your world. So you can worship me. But if you're going to worship me, my name is Primordia. You're not going to call me Sylvanus. I'm not going to answer to Sylvanus. My name is Primordia. Now, these elves could proceed to come up with their own aspect for Primordia, because they could basically say, okay, we worship Primordia now, but then just kind of copy over all their beliefs and customs that they associate with Sylvanus and just do it for Primordia now. And as long as they call her Primordia and they send their prayers and their offerings to Primordia, she's fine with that, and she will create an aspect that will match what they expect. And the aspect could even appear exactly like Sylvanus appeared to them, because Primordia doesn't care if they want her to appear as a man or an oak tree or whatever. She doesn't care about that. Like, appearances are just superficial. They don't matter, but a god's name matters. And part of this is the idea, and this isn't remotely original, but I like it, that the god's names have power. So you do not speak the god's names in vain. And by that, I mean, you don't just say a god's name willy-nilly, because basically anytime someone speaks one of the god's names, they hear it. They're aware of it. So if you say the goddess Ion's name, the goddess herself hears you say her name, and she hears the entire context. So she, can listen to the conversation before time and after time, backwards and forwards from the point you said her name. So not only does she know who you are, where you are, what you're doing, that you said her name, she knows the entire context of what you were talking about when you said her name, how you used her name. And if there is anything she doesn't like about what you were doing when you said her name, there will be consequences. So people of Primordia do not just casually say the names of the gods. And that's, again, one of the reasons why they have these titles and nicknames for them, for the different aspects, is they actually try to avoid using the god's real name unless it's really important. So if I'm going to pray to Primordia, then I would use her name because I want her to hear me. But I wouldn't just say her name in casual conversation, because I don't want her to take notice of me at that moment, because maybe I'm doing something I don't want her to know about, or maybe I'm just not doing something that would impress her, right? I'm just having a stupid conversation over a beer. So I'm not going to call Primordia by name. I might call her Lady of the Forest or Maiden of the Fields or some title like that, instead of saying the word Primordia, because that is her name and that name has power. So people who worship different aspects of a given deity will have different beliefs and practices, and may and probably will see the deity in very different ways. But this isn't going to have any impact on the domains or powers or things like that, because again, there's really only one deity. They just have different perceptions of that deity. Now, all of this that I'm explaining to you is not something that's known or understood by mortals in the world of Primordia. This is all high-level shit that people in the world don't know. Not even the clerics and paladins know this. So, and a key thing to understand here, part of my philosophy or my outlook on this, is that there is a difference between reality and people's perception of reality. And just because someone misperceives reality, that doesn't change what's real. Reality is what it is. It doesn't change just because of whatever thoughts you have in your silly head. So this kind of stuff wouldn't be known by the mortals in the world, but the gods don't care what people believe. They really don't care. They don't care what customs people observe, what taboos they observe, or anything like that. All of those trappings of religion that you think about are invented by the various priests, churches, followers of the gods, etc. Those are created by people for people's reasons. They have nothing to do with the gods. The gods don't care. This is all beneath the gods' notice or concern. It's beneath them. They have way bigger concerns. The gods have their own agendas that are not understood by mortals. Their agendas are what the gods care about. So each god has their own agenda. That's what they care about. They don't care about other shit. The reason that clerics and paladins have the miraculous powers that they do, that other priests and followers of the gods don't have, is that they are serving their god's agenda. So that's what a priest or a paladin does. They serve their god's agenda. And so in Primordia, it's not really a thing of alignment. It's not like, oh, if you're going to follow this aspect of this deity, you have to have this alignment. And if you break your alignment, you're going to lose your powers. That's not how it works in Primordia. It's all about your God's agenda. If you are following your God's agenda, if you are doing the tasks your God lays before you, you're fine. It doesn't matter what your alignment is. God doesn't care about that. Your God does not care. Now, you could be lawful good as lawful good can be, but if you're not doing what your God wants you to do, you can lose your powers. You're not following your God's agenda. You're not working towards your God's aims, whatever those are, which you won't know what they are. You'll just know what your God wants you to do. So clerics and paladins are doing specific tasks at the behest of their God. Although, like I said, they never know the real reason why, but they may think they do, right? But a character might think, oh, I know why I'm doing this, and reason it out, or think they did. Or they may invent a reason or whatever. But in the end, they don't know. They're guessing. They have no clue. And their guess is probably not right because, who can guess the mind of a God, right? They're beyond our comprehension. That's the whole point. They just do what they're told. Clerics and paladins do what they're told. At least if they want to remain clerics and paladins, they do what they're told. The priests and other followers of the gods are really just carrying out a charade. Some of them probably even realize that. Some of them, some of the higher ups in the Church of the Nine probably know that it's all bullshit, but they don't care because they're benefiting from it. They're happy with the power and influence that their position in the church gives them. They don't really care that it's all bullshit, and when they pray, no one listens. They don't care. So this, for me, neatly explains the difference between the PC classes of clerics and paladins who have spells and can do these crazy things, and all the other priests and believers of the gods who don't. And this avoids the problem of having resurrection be a common thing in the world. And this is something, this is where some D&D settings break down, because you think, well, if resurrection is as available as it seems like it is from the published information, it would change the way the entire world works. And it doesn't. These settings are very much what you would expect, and they don't really follow to conclusion what the impact of having resurrection available as it is in those worlds would have. They just ignore that. So, I like in my world, it makes more sense, I think, because priests and clerics, paladins and clerics and various NPC classes that can cast spells, like the Acolyte, I think, is an NPC that can cast cleric spells. Those are rare. They're very, very rare. And most of the people that are, quote, religious don't have any of those supernatural powers. So resurrection isn't common. So we don't have to wonder why people aren't resurrected all the time. They're not resurrected all the time because there aren't that many people that can do that. And those that can do that tend to be part of the guild, and they're out having adventures. They're not sitting around in a temple somewhere waiting to resurrect someone. The only value that the non-cleric and paladin believers have to the gods is as a source of mystical energy. When they pray to the gods, when they give offerings to the gods, they supply a dribble of this mystical energy that the gods use to do whatever it is that they do. They're fuel. Believers and your mundane priests and whatnot of the gods, they're fuel, nothing more. The gods don't care about them. They don't love them. And they don't care what they do or they don't do. They don't care what they believe or don't believe. All they care about is their own agendas and the great game that these gods play among themselves. And that's part of the concept too, is kind of like in Vampire the Masquerade, you had the jihad. It's kind of like that. The gods are in some kind of competition or some kind of game amongst themselves. And so a lot of what they do has to do with that, but that is way beyond mortal comprehension, way above mortal pay grade. The result of all this is that in more than a few religions of Primordia, clerics and paladins are seen as undesirables, and the various churches will actively act against them and try to turn people against them because they're a threat to their political power and their influence, because these clerics and paladins actually do have the god's ear and actually really do serve the gods instead of pretending to, and they have powers that people in the church or churches don't have. And again, most people don't know or understand any of this. Although maybe high-level clerics might have some suspicions about what's really going on, the people are well and truly duped. Now, something interesting is, in the history of the real world, we've seen gods and religions diffuse from culture to culture again and again and again. It happens all the time. The example of this that most of you will probably be familiar with is the appropriation of the Greek gods by the Romans. So the Romans Romanized the Greek gods. So the Greek god Hephaestus became the Roman god Vulcan. The Greek god Aphrodite became the Roman god Venus, and so on. This would never happen in Primordia because the gods are real and they wouldn't put up with it. So the Romans, for example, if this were in Primordia, the Romans could still worship Aphrodite and they could have their own beliefs about who Aphrodite is and what she represents and how she dresses and what she expects of people. And those could all be very Roman ideas, but they would still have to call her Aphrodite because that's her name. And she's not going to tolerate them calling her something else because her name means something. It has power. It's part of what she is. If they didn't do that, if they didn't call her Aphrodite, she might literally come down and level their cities. We're talking about a world where if you tick a god off enough, and if you're doing it as a culture, as a city or a nation, the god could literally, physically, in avatar form, come down and whoop your ass and wipe you off the planet. So in a world like that, where that has happened in the past, it has happened more than once, people tend to take that kind of thing seriously. Every culture, every land, every city has its own spin on the gods, and these are the various aspects. So Primordia might be the goddess of the hunt to one people and goddess of the harvest to another. And they may have very different beliefs about who Primordia is. And those aspects may even have very different alignments and personalities. But they're both Primordia, and they're both known by her true name. So both of those groups of people know that they're worshiping Primordia. They don't think they're worshiping something else. And there will always be room for new aspects. So as I discussed in the last cleric episode that I did, a player could even create a brand new aspect for their cleric character, but there are still only 9 gods. So at the same time, this gives an infinite number of possibilities for diversity and lets a player pretty much create their own god if they want to. But at the same time, it keeps the number of the gods manageable, understandable, and elegant for both the players and the DM. So although I think, this idea with what happened with Sylvanus is interesting, although I don't really care for it personally, it wouldn't go down like that in Primordia. The only worth that a worshiper has to a god, again, is that energy, that mystical fuel that they provide with their worship, their prayers, their offerings, things like that. So if someone is worshiping something other than Primordia or one of the other 9 gods of Primordia, then that energy, if it's going anywhere, it's going nowhere, right? It's not going to one of the gods. It's not accomplishing anything. It's not furthering one of the gods' agendas. So the goddess Primordia would never give them the time of day because they're not doing anything for her. The mortals must meet the gods on the gods' terms. It doesn't work the other way around. The gods don't change who or what they are for mortals. The gods are what they are. Now, all that said, there may ultimately be more than 9 gods because I may either completely redo the domains, which I've considered doing, or just come up with some new ones because there aren't nearly enough. And I haven't decided. I might, if I start creating more domains, I might work it so that each god has 2, so I don't have to come up with more gods. I can just come up with more domains that they share among them. Or, I might come up with new domains and each new domain is a new god. I'm not sure. I would probably come up with the domains first. I would look and see, okay, what domains are we missing that we need, come up with those, and then decide what to do with them. But even if there are more than 9 gods, there won't be very many more, maybe a dozen at the most. My whole point here is to keep the number small and only have 1 god associated with each domain and each domain associated with only 1 god. And again, I'm doing that because I think it's elegant. I think it's simple. And I think that this, having 9 gods, but infinite aspects it kind of is the best of both worlds. It keeps it manageable for the DM and the players, but at the same time, there's plenty of room for a player or the DM putting their own spin on something. Or, you're going to flesh out a new part of the world and you can come up with new aspects for all the gods so that it's a totally different culture and the religions seem very, very different. And you can do that and you don't have to come up with a new pantheon. You don't have to invent new gods and invent new domains and all that crap and confuse the hell out of your players. Because again, they're all going to have the same names. So once your players learn the 9 gods, they're good, because they may go to a new city and they don't know what the people there call Primordia. They don't know what her nickname is there or her title in that city, but the people will know Primordia. And so you can just talk about Primordia and they'll know who you're talking about. So, something that's interesting about this is I wonder sometimes if you're getting sick of hearing about the gods, because I seem to talk about them a lot in this world building episode. And I'm honestly kind of mystified as to why I give it so much thought, because I'm not a religious person in real life. But for some reason, when it comes to my world, like I just really dig the gods and I find them really interesting and I find them great movers of plot. And I really kind of view my gods a lot like the antediluvians in Vampire the Masquerade. They're always behind the scenes, pulling strings. And you don't really know what they're up to. And they're seldom doing anything directly. It's very rare that you can connect an event to a specific god and figure out what god made that happen. But instead, they're acting through their often unwitting agents in the world. And all the time, they're furthering some unfathomable agenda known only to the gods themselves. And I really like that. I think that's really fun concept to play with. I had a lot of fun playing with it in my days running Vampire, and I'm going to have a lot of fun with it in Primordia. All right, well, I think it's about time to wrap up episode 115 and our 17th world building episode. Wrap up this discussion of the gods and religion in Primordia. I want to thank everyone who has contributed feedback for this episode and everyone who's contributed feedback of any kind, whether you're emailing me or tweeting me or commenting on the Google Plus community. It's fantastic stuff. And I just want to give my plug for the Google Plus community for Game Master's Journey. Very lively place lately. Lots of great discussions going on there. There are a few people sharing details of their homebrew worlds there. Some people have shown maps that they've made for their worlds. Really cool stuff. I personally, anytime I find some kind of cool inspirational artwork online, I try to share that with the community. So if you haven't checked out the community, you can find a link in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. Check it out. It's really great stuff. Great place to connect with other GMs and other players. Talk about world building, talk about GMing, or just talk about the RPG hobby in general. And people do a great job. People are really respectful. There's no trolls. There's no douchebags. And people do a great job of being respectful and sharing different ideas. And it's awesome. It's fantastic. And, I've had an idea. I'm just going to put this out there because I know I have a lot of smart listeners. I have this idea. I'm not sure how I would make this happen. But I thought, I started doing these world building episodes and they're kind of taking over the show. As you've probably noticed in season 6, I've done more world building episodes than non-world building episodes. Almost to the point I feel like it's kind of silly to tell you it's a world building episode. It's like pretty soon they're all going to be world building episodes. I don't know. So we're having a lot of fun with this. And I know a lot of you are building your own world. Some of you have worlds you've been working on for decades. Some of you are just starting out. So I thought it would be fun and it would be super cool to create some way, some forum. And by forum, I don't mean literally a forum, although maybe that would work, but some place online where people could post information about their homebrew world. And I'm thinking it'd be so great to have a website where you can go and it's nothing but homebrew worlds. like a nexus of worlds or something. And so you can go there and just read about all these different worlds that other DMs have created and get ideas for your world, or just, see the cool stuff that people come up with. And the other kind of side of that is, if you ever run a high level game, especially if you get up around 20th level or even beyond 20th level, a lot of times you can start to wonder, what can I do? Like, what can we do that we haven't already done? And one thing that's really fun to do with higher level games is to do planar travel and have, the PCs go to the outer planes or the elemental planes and stuff like that. Well, another thing you can do is have your PCs go to another world, or even at lower level, you could have it happen where they go to another world. And, if you're going to do that, instead of having them go to Kryn or having them go to Oerth or something like that, you could have them go to some world that another DM has created that you found out about. And you could either just kind of take that world that the DM created and just use it for a few adventures and have your PCs adventure in that world. Or you could take that world and then riff on it yourself and kind of come up with your own version of that DM's world. I mean, again, it doesn't matter. It's your game. You can do whatever you want. But that'd be really fun. If you wanted to have an adventure or series of adventures where the player characters are traveling to different prime material planes, it'd be a great way to get different worlds for them to visit and not have to do a ton of world building for each, is just go to some kind of database of homebrew worlds and pick one you like and just mine it for ideas. So I think that would be really fun to do. I think that we have enough world builders among the listeners of this show that we could probably, if people participated, we could probably have quite a few worlds for people to check out. So I think that'd be really fun to do. I don't know what the best way to do it would be, though. So I guess that's where I'm asking for help from you. If you think you have a good idea of how to make that happen, probably the best way would be to build a website from the ground up to do it. And honestly, if I was really going to do this, that's probably what I would do. I'd want to do it right. But I don't know, maybe we could make it work with a wiki or a forum or a subreddit or something like that, or a Google Plus community or something. Maybe there's some tool out there that we could use that would work, that would make it super easy, as opposed to building a website from the ground up to do it. But I don't know. Let me know what you think. If you think that's a cool idea, and if you do think it's a cool idea, if you have any ideas of how we can make that happen. And my thought for this is it would be something that people do themselves. So it's not like you submit the stuff to me and I have to do all this data entry to put it up. I'd want it to be something where you could just go on the site yourself and upload your stuff for your world, and boom, there it is. And it would have to, we'd have to worry about, making sure that there's statements as far as, none of this can be used for commercial purposes and whatnot. And it's all, all people reserve their full copyrights and all that good stuff. But it'd be fun if we could figure out a way to do it. And if people were interested in doing it, it might be too much work. I mean, it does seem like it would be a lot of work to upload a lot of information like that. But I know a lot of us are keeping track of stuff for our worlds electronically using like OneNote or Evernote or on a wiki or in Word or something like that. So if you're doing it like that, it'd be just a lot of copy pasting. It wouldn't be nearly as bad as if you've got it handwritten in notebooks and stuff. But it might be worthwhile, because I can tell you, my process of putting everything into one digital document has really helped me organize things. And I think, even if I weren't thinking of one day trying to write a book or maybe one day put it on a website or something like that, just to do it as a way to organize, I think would be worthwhile. Because it's really kind of helped me organize stuff for my world and see how much I've got and kind of what areas are light and what areas are heavy and stuff like that. So yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about the episode. I'm always happy to get feedback from listeners. Always happy to hear what other people have to say. So I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Stanko, Transploid, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.